Hello and welcome to the Logos broadcast. This is being recorded on Sunday, the 22nd of January, 2023. And I'm joined by two good friends of mine, Philip Swanson and Graham Canton. We are here today to discuss the impacts of materialism in the modern world, why Philip and Graham believe that materialism is wrong, basically, and what might be a better way to view the world and our place in it. And it could very well be the case that we are not equipped to have this conversation, but we will do it anyway. So, Philip, I'll start with you. What is materialism as far as you can explain?
Okay, so if you want a short answer, materialism can sort of be described as in a couple of senses, and it can be sort of seen in what it does. So a materialist would say that only, at least in its dumbest form, would say that only material things exist. The only things that are real, that are meaningful, that are factual, is that which we can observe with our senses. And when a materialist sees something, he usually asks two questions: what does it do, and how does it work? Those are the main two questions. So it's a point of view that looks at the world from pure mechanical causality. So, for example, if you take a tree, right, a materialist would not ask what the meaning of the tree is or what the symbol of the tree is. He would directly go for the heart of, okay, well, how does it work? How does it make food? How does it grow roots? Right? Or he would say something, he would ignore the patterns of the stars, right? He wouldn't really talk about the patterns of the stars. He would ask the question, well, what are they made of? And he would look at them through a microscope instead of looking at them in a way in which is actually relates to our real experience, because we don't actually experience the stars through a microscope, right? Or a telescope, excuse me. We don't actually experience the stars that way, right? Or he'd do the opposite of the inverse. He'd look at certain cells through a microscope. That's not to say that any of these things are bad or evil, but when we place our entire worldview on that and apply that sort of mindset to everything, including stories, the Bible, whatever, that's when it becomes destructive. So that's what, in my sort of short view, that's what I would say materialism boils down to.
Graham, do you have an answer to that could add or I don't know, refine what he just said?
I would probably just take this. I agree with Philip. I would say that at the heart of materialism is utilitarianism, and that's something that we should attack in this conversation. If we're only looking at the parts and the mechanism of things instead of actually saying, does this have an essence or something that's unseeable that relates to our spiritual reality, that means that we can only really look at something for how it's useful. And since we derive meaning from the use of something, we have to look at its parts and break it down to the sum of its parts. And that's honestly just an inhuman, cold, excessively analytical standpoint to take. And I would ultimately say that the antidote to that would be religion. Or in a broader way, I would say that the antidote to that would be spirituality, or the acceptance or leap of faith into something which is unseeable, but is in a sense knowable.
To what extent would either or both of you acknowledge the utility of this, let's say, a spiritual view of the world in terms of, I don't know, how everything is built and basically any technology or whatever? Like, surely you must concede some utility in materialism, and how far does that go for you guys, and where must that stop? I'll go to Graham first.
So yes, there are utilities to things that are material, obviously, and that's not per se a bad thing. It just depends on whether or not that utility takes precedent over something that it should be used for. So we would say, if I buy a PlayStation 4 and I'm using it because I want to play games and have fun and be lazy, if that takes precedent over, actually that's a terrible example. Let's just say that I'm obsessed with shopping, right? And shopping is a good thing and you need clothes. If it exits the realm of necessity and enters the realm of excess, I would say that's problematic. So it's good for the human to understand that we need something and that we also want something, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. We can want and need the same thing, but whenever it drives into excess and it becomes a distraction for understanding the world in a more I guess you could say, human way, like there's more than just like, I need to shop, I need to consume, then it becomes a problem.
Philip, how about you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't outright reject. Well, I mean, the Bible has a skeptical view of technology. I'll say that if you look at its origins, right? I mean, where does technology come from in the Bible? It's Cain's line. So there's all you need to know, sort of right off the bat.
It's Cain's what? Can you say it again? It's Cain's what?
Cain's line. It's Cain's lineage. It's Tubal Cain. I'm blanking on the other names right now. But it's Cain's sons who they derive. It's metallurgy. So making, taking things from the earth and shaping them to do what? Well, to make weapons for war. It's husbandry, so animal farming, killing and slaughtering animals, and it's music making. And people are like, well, what's wrong with music? Music is good. Look at the church's patrimony of Gregorian chant and polyphony and other such things. But music wasn't exactly used for that, back then. A lot of there were certain even types of music that didn't have lyrics, right? I mean, we think of filthy, dirty music today, but there was music back then that was even considered by Plato and other such philosophers to be unfit for public consumption because of the effects it had on people. Let the reader understand, sort of thing. So I don't, I don't think that it can be outright rejected, but we have like the danger is the knowledge we've traded, right? So in his book, the language of creation, Matthew Pajot makes the point that the story of the garden really is the story of our trading of its knowledge, right? When humanity takes the fruit, he says this: at this point, humanity has opened its eyes to such an extent that our conception of space and time corresponds to the point of view of an alien robot gazing at our solar system from a faraway region, right? So we've really, like the Copernican revolution, even too, we can break it down even further, is a story of trading this knowledge, right? And I think it's very dangerous because we've left this spiritual knowledge behind. We've forgotten how to interact and engage with the world to such an extent that our culture has become one of pure convenience, right? You look at the way, most people would say cars are great. I love cars. Cars are fun. That's the idea most people have. They're convenient. They help us travel faster. Look at all the good things that we've done with cars, right? Well, the problem is we don't think that what cars have done to culture, right? Because cars, at least in American society, have all but destroyed any sort of culture that could have been argued to be there to begin with. And that's because cities, you look at them, they're designed for cars, not people. The way that America is set up, it's designed for not people. It's designed for cars, not people. So now you got fast food restaurants designed for cars, not people, right? We got these quick drive-ins designed for cars, not for people. Gas stations have to pop up everywhere because everything is designed for cars and not for people, and that has destroyed culture. Right? Like even most cities, you see they have like one little small downtown area, but nobody lives there, right? Maybe a few people, maybe there's a few apartments, but there's no real community. There's no real gathering space. I mean, you may have like a civic center where old people go to play bingo on Tuesdays, but that's about it. That's really that's really all there is, right? And everything else is just a periphery. It's just sort of everything's been pushed to the edge, and in a sense, so if we've isolated ourselves from each other because of this knowledge we've gained, right? So that's really my view. It's not all bad, but we weren't ready for it.
You said trading of knowledge. Can you really quickly explain what's being traded in exchange for what, as simply as you can?
Yeah. So what's being traded is asking what a thing means, asking what its symbol is, asking what higher meaning it has, to what can this be used for, right? So we see a tree. We don't ask what it means, right? We don't ask, okay, how does this thing fit into the whole of creation? We ask, what can I do with this? How can I use this thing to make something? and so we've traded this knowledge, right? We have great knowledge about how atoms work, about how cells work, about how how our digestive system works, but we don't know like the symbolism of, for example, intoxication, or other such things, right? We don't have a full picture of how these things work, right? Or even food. Like you could take food, for example. There's a symbolic element to food, right? You take food in and it becomes part of you, right? Not and the materials will say, well, yeah, of course it does. It builds muscle and all this other stuff, but that's not the point, because you get this notion of a foreign element, right? And that can even be applied on a higher level to foreign peoples or to foreign objects, right? And that's why we lose it, right? It comes up because we can't properly integrate it into ourselves. And once again, we don't look at it in that way. We look at it, oh well, the stomach does this or however all of that works.
Graham, have you anything to add? Graham, you're muted.
I'd actually like to respond to a few of the points that Philip made. Actually, probably all of them. First on music and technology, and then on authentic human progress, and then on the cars. I have a very strong opinion about cars as well. So,
Graham,
fellas,
sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask real quick? A table, does that count as technology?
Yes.
Yeah.
Strictly speaking.
Perfect. Graham, go ahead.
Yeah.
However, we shouldn't be so obtuse as to think like, well, are you against tables because you're against technology? We clearly understand that at a certain point, intuitively, technology reaches something that's a little bit more like black magic instead of like legitimate carpentry.
Yeah,
Perfect. This is important. When you get a chance, I'd like either or both of you to try to make that distinction, as it were. Where is that line? But go ahead.
Yeah, that's important.
I'll go ahead and actually make a quick distinction. I'm not going to be able to substantiate it very well, but this actually plays exactly into the topic at hand, materialism. We intuitively understand that there's a huge difference between a table, which actually can be more like art, right? Because no one's going to make actually nowadays they will, because we've reached that point in liberalism where it's just like the ugliest thing ever, here you go, and we're going to gaslight you into thinking it's beautiful, because we don't want to make anything that actually uplifts the soul. And so people have kind of lost this idea of what a beautiful thing actually is. And so we can't really differentiate between art and technology anymore. And that's why you hear that common rebuttal, well, is it table technology? Because they want to get you where they feel like you're lacking, which is that they feel like you probably don't really understand the human spirit, just like they don't. But it's actually really intuitive. A table can be art, but it's also can be technology. And those things aren't mutually exclusive. But if you look at a smartphone, and you look at the pros and cons of a smartphone, it's way more like technology. It's way less integral to the human experience than a table is, right? And so based on if a table is integral to the human experience, which it is, and a smartphone isn't per se, it's more like a supplement to make things easier and more convenient, whereas a table is just like a natural consequence of us being standing, bipedal, and we do things like right in this plane right here as opposed to way down here. A table just makes sense. It's properly utilitarian. That would be my first point about is a table technology kind of thing. All right, about music and technology, what Philip was talking about. I think a lot of people are probably instantly turned off when you hear a guy say, like music's actually terrible and it came from Cain. It's like, okay, yeah. However, it's true. But the easy way to make that more palatable, I think, for most people, especially Catholics, is to understand the church's role in culture and civilization in the last 2,000 years, and even ancient Judaism's role in culture in the last 2,000, 3,000 years. So the precedent for the church, and as it relates to culture, is it baptizes music and technology. So when it baptizes it, it basically subsumes it and says, this is the way that you should actually use it, as opposed to a vain, empty way. It should all be centered toward Christ. And then it proceeds downward to become something baptized and holy. So it's not that all music is bad, but it should proceed from an understanding of God in a higher order, as opposed to just being fleshly. So one of my favorite examples is this, of this exact thing is, in the Middle Ages in Spain, there was a pilgrimage, I can't remember where to, and the pilgrims would often stay at this monastery, I think, in Spain. and they wanted to dance and have fun and do their, pilgrim stuff. And the monks were like, you can't do that here. This is like a holy place. So then they took a folk chant. It was called Polarum Regina, Queen of the Poles is the English translation, or it's one of a few English translations. And they basically took a Latin chant and they made it kind of fun. It's really fun. You can actually find it online. It's a fun, like medieval kind of dance. And that's a perfect example of people taking what the church has said is ordered and making it fun and actually spirited. Technology on that point. The church did baptize technology, and we've never been shy to use technology, whether it be aqueducts or whether it be tools to farm and to mill. We've always used them. And in those days, we actually understood technology to be one of many gears in a working civilization, as opposed to taking individual things and reducing them to the sum of their parts to derive meaning from it. So in the old days, if you could say that, we would take things and we would understand them as useful to a machine, right, a civilization, and they play their part, but they're not the sum of their parts. Nowadays, because there isn't really a machine, everything is just reduced to the sum of its parts, because that's the closest association we can make to the natural order of things, even though it's empty. Now,
when you say machine, what do you mean? What's the machine?
The culture. Culture and civilization is a machine.
Perfect. Okay.
So it should be properly geared and ordered, and there shouldn't necessarily be an excess. When there's an excess, you get into essentially civilizational gluttony, and that plays a huge part in the promotion of materialism, especially in the liberal global West. Authentic human progress. Actually, I'll skip that. Responding to the car thing. So I'm very opinionated about cars, just like Philip, and it does destroy culture and civilization, and it does destroy an anthropocentric view of the world, which can sound selfish, but it's actually necessary. Whenever you start replacing people with things in order of importance, you actually do have to return to an anthropocentric worldview. It's not necessarily at odds with church teaching and the understanding of the natural law. One thing that I'm really big about with cars is the distance it creates between communities, right? So yeah, there's like the downtown with the bingo, and then like everybody goes back, everyone drives 15 minutes back to their suburban hell, and then they watch Netflix. But that distance, the gas stations plays a huge part in that. Nowadays, there's really no such thing as a community, right? No such thing as a community. If you're in a community, it's your zip code, and that's sad, right? Yeah, man, I'm from 35537 or whatever, or some stupid thing like that, instead of like I'm from Cromwell or I'm from Athens. Yeah, the 251. So you see, there's already a problem here. You can see that there's a difference. Like I'm from Fairhope, for example. What does that mean? Or I'm from Athens, Georgia. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, because there are 100 splintered communities, all separated by highways. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, you're fine. Just to make a distinction, of course there are communities, but I think you might refine that and say they're not dictated by locale specifically. So, for example, a school community or a Gaelic football team or a church community, I mean, they are communities, right? Like, surely. You're saying there are no communities. Can you kind of, I don't know.
To jump in real fast, I do want to get back to that point, because of how we view communities. I think, at least in terms of in how the materialist views communities, I think it's completely wrong, and it has to do with the body of certain things and how we view bodies and bodiliness. But we'll jump to that later. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, Graham, can you respond to that?
Yeah, I'll finish that point real quick, because I want to hear more about what Philip has to say about that. I will say, I just did a quick Google search, classic, of the definition of community. The first definition, which would probably mean it's the more common definition and more applicable, especially in this sense, is a group of people living in the same place or having particular characteristics in common. If the only thing that makes you similar among other people is your zip code and your school, and everything else diverges from there, that's not a community. You're LARPing as a community because you want to feel that intimate human fellowship with other people, which is intrinsically spiritual, and it's not really demonstrable unless you want to get into like biochemistry and other such things. There is a deep urge to be in fellowship with other people and have common goals, interests, and all of that is made possible by locale. So that's what I say when it's not really a community. It says it's a community, but that's because people can't really come to terms with the fact that if everyone lives at least 30 minutes apart in some radius, it's not a community. You can't walk to the store. You got to get in your, crappy vehicle from 2004 and drive to CVS, or you know, it's not Blockbuster anymore, but you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, sort of. You said shared interest. That was part of your definition, and I don't know, to be a pain in your neck.
Go for it.
The examples I gave do fit that definition. But they don't
Okay.
fit what you just said. You did say, well, they might live 30 minutes away, and fair enough.
I would let me interject here. Not to be rude. First one. One last thing on technology, and then I'll hit into this. Technology, I would say, ultimately, at the end of the day, right, is in a sense, it is a modification, right? It's a modification of natural patterns, right? So music is just patterns, right? It's just arranging certain noises, certain patterns in nature into a harmony, into a melody, right? And you can do that for good or you can do it for bad. Your choice, right? You can do it for ill, you can do it to worship God, you can do it for ill, you can do it to seduce, to invoke hatred, to invoke anger, to start a riot, or you can do it for good. You know, you can use it to praise God. You can use it to, you know, to have a communal dance, these sorts of things. Right? And you see this clearly in Genesis, right? Because what they're doing is, right, there's these natural patterns above, right? There's these angels, there's these what you would call spirits or patterns, principalities that are above, right? And they're where they belong, right? God creates everything and he assigns spiritual beings to these certain aspects of creation, right? Because things don't just move by themselves. We know this, right? The natural world works itself out. It doesn't just do stuff. There has to be something animating it, and we'll get to that later. But it's a sort of it's a modification of these patterns, and that everything's going right in Genesis, and then right we see a pulling down of the pattern. They're not supposed to modify that pattern to satisfy what? What do they want? What are they after? Well, they're after knowledge, right? Because of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So they're after this. It's this knowledge, right? They're seeking after this knowledge, and this is sort of supplemented in a way in the Book of Enoch, right? Which is, you know, if you're Ethiopian Orthodox and it's canonical, if you're anything else, it's apocryphal. Not to put that in scare quotes, but it's not one of the apocryphal does not mean fake, by the way. For everybody out there, just because something's apocryphal doesn't mean it's not true. In fact, many of the traditions of the church come from these quote unquote apocryphal books. However, in Enoch, right, it's what happens. Well, there's these higher principalities that come down, right, and they teach people certain things: metallurgy, makeup, music, sorcery, stone cutting, these sorts of things. And you can imagine all the horrible things that they're used for, right? So they're taking these natural things in the world, which can be used for something good, such as you can use gold or something or something of the sort to adorn a beautiful church, or you can use it to, you know, a prostitute can use it to seduce, as was common in the ancient world. Nowadays, prostitutes don't really do that, but whatever. And so it's this, they're once again, it's this modification of the natural order. And at the end of the Book of Enoch, or somewhere in there, Enoch actually goes up to heaven and he sees the patterns playing themselves out, right? God was going to reveal these patterns to humanity, right? But what are they using the patterns for? They're using the patterns to satisfy their own desires. So in a sense, technology is always inherently connected to some sort of desire, be it good or ill. Most of the time it's bad, as we see, right? Well, like, what do most people use the internet for, right? Most of the stuff on the internet is not good stuff. Ironically, we're doing this on the internet, but whatever. So that's my one point. That's my one point on technology, right? It's this modification of the natural world. And that's the way it's presented in scripture. That's the way it's presented in all of these ancient texts, at least, you know, Second Temple Jewish text, which is, you know, the continuation, which is Christianity. Point number 2 about communities. We have this notion, once again, as Graham was saying, to go back, about like material things just being the sum of their parts. Right. But you would not say that about yourself necessarily. Well, a materialist would, many such as David Hume, right? He would just say, well, you're just a collection of things. Right. But the problem is that these things that we're made up of exist somewhere out there by themselves. Right. So we're made up of I think we're made up of like carbon. Carbon, water is another one that humans are made up of. Right. Calcium in our bones, all of these different elements. Right. But those things exist. We can find these things outside nature. Right. So what's the difference between us and them? Right. What is making these things interact in such a way that they're sort of taken up and creates me, creates you, creates Graham, creates you, dear listener. Right. Like what's the difference? Right. Well, there has to be some spiritual principle taking all of these things and uniting them together. Right. And it's the same thing, right? But why do we stop there, right? We wouldn't just say like, oh, I'm just a bunch of arms, ears, toes, eyes, and a mouth, right? Because that's absolutely ridiculous, right? Or I'm carbon and some water and other such elements. That's ridiculous, right? You'd say I'm a human, right? And so you have the soul that takes all these parts, puts them all up into one thing, and that's you, right? And then but we stop there for some reason. For some reason, we stop there and we just sort of scratch our heads and like, well, that's all there really is to reality, right? We just stop there. What we don't realize is cities work the same way. So when you're a part of a city, right? It doesn't matter if you're mindlessly scrolling on your phone. You're part of a body bigger than yourself, with a spirit animating that body, right? That's where this concept of like gods of a city comes from, right? They didn't just see the gods as like, oh, this god is like the person the deity our city is named after, right? They saw themselves as a part of that god's body, right? So Athens, it was an extension of Athena's body, right? And we can even take this up to the body of Christ. It's not just something like some nice like social club that's sort of we gather together and have a good time. We're part of this club, right? It's
Grant, can you mute yourself if you're not talking? Sorry, Philip, keep going.
It's literally right. We're part of this body, right? We're part of something higher, and there's a spirit in charge of that, and we can participate in that spirit, or we can choose to reject it, right? So, like the spirit of New York City, for example, probably not a good one. Probably not a good one, right? But you are right. It's like Jonathan Pageau. I would recommend watching this. Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke have this conversation, right? Where it's what they call a reverse parasitic process, right? So a parasite will latch onto a host and drain it, blah, blah, blah. Well, a reverse parasitic process obviously is that in reverse, right? A higher principle takes all of these things, right, and brings them up into themselves. So we see like a mob, for example, because mobs do things that individual people don't do on their own. Like nobody goes and riots and loots and destroys by themselves. That's ridiculous. Nobody does that, right? The only context it's ever done is in a mob. So they're losing some of their autonomy to this higher thing. Some of their autonomy is being taken up, being taken from them, and brought up into this higher principle, higher spiritual principle that now controls that group, right? That body is now, those people are now part of that spirit's body. Yeah. So my point about the city and the body and communities, right? About destroying communities, right? Is we feel like we're dying because things are not the sum of their parts, right? So we feel isolated, we feel lonelier than ever because we're supposed to be part of a bigger body. If I cut off my thumb, right, my thumb's not going to last. It's going to die, right? So if we're cut off from these communities, which we're supposed to be a part of, then no wonder people are more depressed than ever, have more anxiety than ever. There's more of these sort of mental disabilities, there's this huge talk now around mental health. No wonder these things are popping up because we're not part of communities. We're cutting ourselves off from these communities. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean we should go participate in the spirit of New York City because we're desperate for community. but it is to say it's not just us, right? It's not just a sum of its parts. There's a higher spirit that animates that body, and if we cut ourselves off from it, it's going to kill us.
I do have a
Graham,
point actually about
go ahead,
that.
yeah.
I think that rolls really well into what exactly I was trying to say about community and the importance of locale, right? Well, to your rebuttal, I guess you could say that. Yes, you can be like 30 minutes apart in either direction and still be in like a quote community. And like everyone being close together is important, and it's also important in an opposite way, because everyone can be very close, or everyone can share one or just a few common beliefs or attitudes and still be very separated, which is, of course, I would say a result of materialism, right? I would say that's a result of people actually reducing things to the sum of their parts and falsely attributing certain, I guess you could say, group dynamics to communities. So New York City is per se a community, but it's not really. Everyone's really close per se, but not really, because everyone's also very separated. And there's that notorious attitude among New Yorkers that Southerners especially have a huge hatred for, which is that they're all cold and they're all very unwelcoming, but they're all like right next to each other. They pass by, they walk by each other. It's a false community. Everyone's close, but they've never been further.
So both of you have made the case that materialism isn't a sufficient way to interpret the world and to observe the world, or reality, maybe. So, Philip, I think the burden is on you, or someone who objects to materialism, to provide an alternative. So, can you try to do that clearly and relatively concisely? If not materialism, then what and why?
Yeah. So I don't. I think there's two ways to go about it. I'm just going to I'll give one now and then one later. But I think the first thing that we have to sort of think of and go through is that there is a spiritual realm, and we have to think, well, okay, well, how does that spiritual realm start? How do we even begin to sort of recognize it? And I think it starts from the top down with being itself, right? So Saint Thomas Aquinas, who was for those of you who don't know about him, was a 13th century Dominican friar. He was born in Aquino in about the year 1225. And I can give more on his story because I have a big devotion to him. Graham, obviously, as well, has a great devotion to him. But he was a Dominican friar. Spent much of his life in study at these big universities, Paris, Cologne, other such places. Was one of the big heavy hitters of the academic world in the 13th century. And was not just an intellectual, sort of abstracted and sort of pulled away from the spiritual world as we see, as was the case a lot of the times in the Middle Ages and even today. But he had a true love for Christ, and I think that's what distinguished St. Thomas from a lot of these other sort of bigwig academic figures of his day. But when he was about 30 years old, he wrote a paper, or if you can call it, or a treatise called De Ente et Essentia, which is on essence and existence, roughly translated. And the argument sort of goes like this, right? So if we have to define the terms, right? So essence is defined as that which constitutes a thing in its proper genus and species, and is signified by the definition of a thing. And that definition comes from Dr. Gavin Kerr, who is a professor at St. Patrick's in Maynooth, Ireland. The material substances, essence is not the form alone, but includes form and matter, right? So form is the spiritual principle, right? That which gives shape to the thing, that which makes up the thing, that's which gives molds the thing, and matter, the stuff it's made out of, right? So it includes form and matter. The essence of a simple substance is form alone. So that would be angels, right? They're not made up of material stuff, right? So in providing his argument for the existence of God, St. Thomas is what the first thing he does, right? He does like this thought experiment, right? And this is often something you see philosophers do. So he says this, and I disagree with him on a certain point here, but we'll get into that later about what he defines as existence. It doesn't make the whole argument fall apart by any means, but I think I disagree with him about how he frames existence, right? But logically speaking, he comes to the right conclusion. So he states this: I can understand what a man is or what a phoenix is, and yet not know whether they have existence in the real world. So this is a rather straightforward definition. So I can know what a tree is, right? I can know a tree is, it has branches, roots, symbolizes hierarchy, is the center, right? It's a fractal pattern. You know all these things about a tree, right? But I can know what a tree is. I can give its definition. But strictly speaking, right, I don't know anything about a particular tree, right? I can know what a tree is without knowing whether a particular tree I have in mind exists. The key word here is understand, right? So the difference, St. Thomas states that one can understand the difference between the essence and existence of a phoenix or a man, but does not necessarily make them distinct in reality, right? So this is to say that the essence of a thing as known is distinct from the fact of the thing's existence as known. So to put it in more simple terms, once again, I can say that I exist, or this exists, or that exists, or Santa Claus exists. I can sort of think in my head, but I can say I know what Santa Claus is, I know what he does, but that doesn't necessitate that he exists. Obviously, I would argue that Santa Claus does exist, but that's a thing for another time. So then from there, St. Thomas continues his thought experience. So he's like, okay, well, say a thing does exist, in which esse, which once again is the act of being, the existence of the thing, and essence, right? So esse is the act of being, and essence, the definition, what a thing is. So propose a being, say there's a being in which they're the same. We have to pretend for the second they're the same. So St. Thomas says that if a being did exist, there can only be one such being. For you cannot have more than one of something except in two ways. So by the addition of some difference, right? So Graham and I are both persons, but we have differences, right? One of the things is that I'm tall and he's short. Or I'm relatively tall and he's relatively short, right? So not to pick on Graham, but or I'm really strong and Graham's not as strong as me, right? So we have these differences between.
I'd like to point out for the record that second one is not true.
So we have these.
But the first one is.
We have these differences. All right. So if such a being did exist, there can only be one. So you can only have more than one thing by the addition of some difference, or by the reception of form into diverse matters, as the nature of species is multiplied and into diverse individuals. Right. So once again, there's this notion of matter differentiating. Right. Graham and I are both human persons, right? But in a way, we're differentiated by matter, right? We're differentiated by the stuff we're made up of. That's how you can tell a difference between Graham and I. That's at least from a material point of view. That's how you can see the difference between Graham and I. So there cannot be one. There can only be one thing that's just existence, right? There can only be one thing that's pure existence. So from here, St. Thomas has made, the simple logical distinction. That's what he's been through. So then he gets into the actual argument for God's existence. So he begins his argument for God's existence with a fairly obvious statement. And he states that which belongs to a thing belongs to its by its nature, such as laughter belongs to man, or is caused by something external, such as light in the air from the sun, right? So there's certain things that belong to us by nature. We have an intellect, we can think, that is sort of ingrained in our nature, or there's a reception, of something. There's something external. There's something added. So we can say clothes, for example. That's something external. That's a garment of skin, if you will, added. Then he goes on to state that it is impossible for the essence of a thing to be the cause of its existence. For then it would have to exist prior to itself, be its own efficient cause, that is to say, bring itself into existence, all of which is impossible, right? So nothing can exist prior to itself. That's illogical, right? Nor can anything bring itself into existence, because that would have to already exist to bring itself into existence in the first place. But that doesn't make sense, right? So a finite thing, right? So thus in those things, he says, in which essence and esse are distinct, exist, receive their existence from something else, right? Because if you are not the same thing as your existence, if your humanity is distinct from your existence, right? You don't exist in virtue of yourself. Just because you're human just because there's a human being, right, doesn't necessitate that it exists. Because you can die, right? Then you don't exist. At least not in the same way anymore. All right. So those things in which essence and esse are distinct exist. What's in Latin is called per aliud, which is they are caused to exist by another and exist through another. So not only they're brought into existence by another and held in existence by another. Right? So then in that case, right, there has to be a first cause. Because we don't see essence, esse composites, right? We don't see human beings, we don't see trees, we don't see rocks bring themselves into existence. Right? So St. Thomas here is talking about an essentially ordered causal series, right? Which, in layman's terms is a series of things that don't exist, that are dependent on something for existence, such as a car engine, right? You turn the car on, if you cut the battery, it's dead. The car's not running anymore, right? As opposed to something existing per se, which is so. And then he gets to the final point, right? There can't be a infinite series of these causes, right? It just can't be man begets man begets man begets man begets man begets man, right? Because none of those men exist in virtue of themselves, right? So there has to be something that's holding these things together that's not material, right? Because we already talked about this. If it's something material, it doesn't exist in virtue of itself because the form is received into the matter, right? So its being is limited by its matter. So thus, due to the impossibility of an infinite series of essence esse composites, St. Thomas concludes there must be a being whose essence and esse are one and is the cause of all existence that we call God. Does that make sense? Do I need to clarify anything about that?
So on the last point, you're essentially saying that God is and subsists within himself. So he can't not be, and therefore everything must be from him.
Yes.
Because there's no like further regression from God himself.
Yes.
Being like what he is and what he can come from.
Yeah.
Okay. So I actually have a quick question to use a materialist's point. So there have been a lot of developments recently in the field of quantum mechanics. We've all heard it. And there are these elementary particles, I think they're quarks, but I can't remember exactly what they're called, that seem to appear and disappear out of existence unpredictably. So one could appear that wasn't, and one could disappear and never be again. So how would you respond to that? So you're making a defense of the metaphysical, using the physical in a manner of speaking, because you're saying nothing that's physical could be, because that would require a physical antecedent, but everything physical requires a first cause. So how does that explain the quarks that come in and out of existence? Do those just do that by virtue of there already being creation per se?
Yeah, well, I mean, once again, if they're going out of existence, right, that means they don't exist in virtue of themselves, right? They can't. If something exists in virtue of itself, it can't not exist. It's impossible because it is being, right? And you can't just not be if it is. Then it's not that. Then it was never that thing to begin with, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was never that thing to be. It was never that thing to begin with. If it can go out of existence, then it was lacking something, and therefore it's not being in and of itself.
So you would say it's lacking like the it's lacking the trait to be independent of itself and its being.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Which means it's dependent on another thing.
Yeah, it's dependent on something else.
Okay.
So
But
go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's one of those common like gotcha moments. Like how can, and obviously it's so obtuse to begin with. I mean, if you're trying to make an argument, this is the one thing that always irks me, is the physical world can actually demonstrate the metaphysical world. But the problem is that when people try to only use the physical world to demonstrate against the metaphysical world.
Yeah.
So, and I use world sparingly there with metaphysical, but we'll say like, well, because there are things and they can't not be by themselves, there must be another thing that makes them be or not be. And then people will respond by saying, well, how come there are things that are and then aren't? It completely misses the point, goes right over their head. So that's essentially why I asked that, is to just kind of like expose that discussion a little bit. And I knew Philip had a response. So
Yeah, and the thing too is like there's an argument, right, that comes up such as from guys like Bertrand Russell, right? Because we don't want to just leave this sort of Bertrand Russell, who was a 20th century British mathematician and philosopher, if you can call him that. He was obviously is a very well known atheist, big well known in the new atheist movement. But Russell basically states, right, well, there's no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause, right? He's just supposing something, which is a problem, right? Because supposing is like, well, there's no reason to think, but he doesn't actually give any evidence or scientific evidence or whatever. And we've already demonstrated why that's not the case. St. Thomas actually, his point on this is actually very interesting because he flirts with the idea like, okay, well, maybe the world was always existed, but he says the only way we can actually know it is according to divine revelation in the book of Genesis, right? So Russell then states, nor on the other hand, is there any reason why it should have not always existed. There's no reason to suppose that the world had a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. And that is a direct quote from his little speech called Why I Am Not a Christian. So I'm not strawmanning this guy's arguments. I'm just saying what he said. And once again, like we have to argue, right, that the world, at least to the even using just the materialist argument, when you use the materialist argument, the world is just made of material things, right? Well, if the world is just made of material things, right, it doesn't matter whether the world is infinitely old or not, because it is made of material things, right? And these material things, as we recall, subsist in virtue of the material from which they are made. Therefore, they cannot be said to be subsistent existence, and thus require a cause that is pure esse, pure existence, to hold them into existence. A cause that is, well, it's God, right? So even if you take the hard and fast, the world's always existed and it's made of just material things, even that, I believe, falls flat on its face.
Okay, Graham, Philip has argued for God's existence. You wanted to make a broader point about spirituality. So do you mind going there, or are we missing anything in between?
I would just have a brief point. Speaking of Russell, I have qualms with his quote about poverty of the imagination being exactly why we suppose that there must have been only a creator and then creation, as opposed to there always having had been creation. I think in and of itself, see, this is the problem with atheism is I think it's almost a necessary evil, except when it becomes religious. And now when you have a renowned atheist like Russell saying that poverty of the imagination is why we can't suppose that material always existed. I think that in and of itself requires a leap of faith, right? Because the actual position of Christians is that essentially we can't really know, right? But we can suppose. And so, in a similar way, it almost requires a leap away from well, this would be tough to articulate, but poverty of imagination. Let me order my thoughts here for a second.
It's ironic. Yeah, I mean,
That's
it's ironic. Yeah.
I would say that him saying a poverty of he's basically saying that there are things we cannot know because our imagination is limited. And I would say that there are things that, true, we cannot know unless they've been revealed to us, or unless we can actually come to understand that there is something we don't know by our reason itself. So we're actually not using our imagination to suppose that God exists. We're using our reason, and then we reach a breaking point where we're like, okay, after this, we have no idea. But it's most reasonable to suppose that there was something before, and there is something always, and that we came from that. I don't know if that's a coherent point or if I really illustrated what I was thinking well there, but that's, pick it apart for what you will.
Graham, what's your email address if people want to give you grief?
Gokickdirt@yahoo.com.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, back to the broader point. Can you talk about spirituality more generally as an alternative to materialism?
Yes. I think Philip has decently demonstrated in as much time as we've actually spent talking about this that God can very well exist. And I would say to those that are not convinced that God exists at all, I think most people have an innate understanding that there's something that they don't know because their imagination is impoverished, right? There is something that they don't know because they can't imagine it, and because they don't know it, they will always attribute mysteries and qualms of life to something beyond themselves, because every person's locus is only concerned with what they can know and understand and imagine. And so people, whether they say they're spiritual or not, will always be quasi-spiritual. And for that reason, it doesn't make sense, at least from a purely rational standpoint, to say that everything is only per se its matter or the sum of its parts, right? It's actually beneficial to just wing it and be like, whatever, this means something more than just what it is and what it's useful for. And that would be the extent of my point about why spirituality is important, if you don't want to take the leap of faith and believe in the divine revelation of Jesus Christ. I would say that because everybody is inclined towards spirituality, it's a helpful tool to understand the world in a sense of mystery, right? Because that's the human spirit, it's very mysterious. And even atheists engage in this pursuit, right? Everything's a little bit mysterious. We don't know what is and what isn't. And everyone's always going to take a position about something that they don't understand. Always. So even skepticism is a position, right? And so the best position to take in this case, I would say, is something means something to everybody. And that sounds subjective, and that's because it is, right? But I would say that if everybody kind of believed in their own meaning about life, then we would at least be somewhere, as opposed to if we strictly said nothing means anything, so come up with it on your own. I would say that if you're not going to accept Jesus Christ, your best position until you get to that point would be to say everything means something different to somebody, but at least it still means something. So that would be my position.
Is that a bit like saying objective truth doesn't exist, I just don't know what it is? Kind of.
Yeah, right. Right, and you spend the whole of your life basically assigning objectivity to certain things, whether you understand them or not. And ultimately, I mean, I would argue that would lead you directly to Jesus Christ if you did it, sincerely. But that's another conversation, maybe for episode 7.
Okay, so this is episode 1. So where to next? I have in the notes the Giants. I don't know. We're not talking about the New York Giants, but I don't know. Is it time to go there? Are we ready? Are we missing anything? What Graham? Where are you going, Graham?
I think we need to make one more jump. I think in the realm of.
This is on air, by the way. So just go. Don't answer that. I don't know. Just go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of the realm of spirituality, I think that we often once again, we have to go back. Okay, well, we have, like, once again with the points that I says, all right, we have this being, right? But we see creation being governed in a certain way, right? We see these, what we call, irrational things, such as trees, such as, even patterns of the stars, waters. Waters are a bit more chaotic and they symbolize something else, but we can get into that later. They all follow this pattern of creation, right? And that's because we would say that this higher being, right, doesn't govern things by himself, right? But he governs things through certain means, right, which we would call other spiritual beings, right? Because there are certain things in our experience, right, that, like, once again, to go back for the mob, for example, right? Once again, we know that there's something in charge of that, right? It's obviously not God, right? But there's a certain being, there's a certain spirit in charge of that mob, right? But it's not just in charge of people, it's in charge of governing um creation. And I think that's important to keep in mind, right? So there's these sort of good things, there's these bad things. We can also make the point that there's these neutral things, but that's a point for another time, and it comes from some more obscure traditions, which most people aren't so well versed on. Basically, it comes from this sort of apocryphal Second Temple Jewish literature, of these, where we find these neutral spirits, which the Anglo-Saxons actually thought were were the origin of fairies. So, but that's a discussion for another time.
Graham, anything before we go to the giants?
Yes, giants are probably real, and they're being covered up by them to basically say that there's nothing more than you and me and the things we need to use and consume. But unironically, though, I really think that.
Hold up a second, Graham. I'm a little slow. I lost that. What are you saying there?
I'm really just playing around. I was saying that giants do exist, and they've always existed, and the powers that be, if you will, are covering up the existence of giants to continue to delegitimize material evidence for the divine. But that's like a half serious point. A really serious point is that there used to be a spiritual veil, if you will, that existed through the Middle Ages and even in the times of Judaism and paganism, where the whole world understood that there was something just a little bit more than what meets the eye. And that seems to have been torn recently, that spiritual veil, since I would say roughly the Enlightenment era in the 1700s, when many philosophers really decided to crack down on the idea, not really crack down, but support the idea that everything we need to know to attribute meaning to things is what we can see and observe. And I think that as silly as it sounds, and it does sound silly, we need to have discussions about things like giants and things about creationism and things like fairies and things like myths. Because although it seems irrational, it does fuel the human spirit of discovery and mystery, and it helps us to actually see a little bit beyond ourselves, even if there's no such thing as giants and fairies. So that would be my argument in support of discussing things like giants and the Anunnaki and things like that. So, yeah. Anyway, have at it, Philip.
That would be your what? Sorry, I didn't hear that word. That would be my something.
Yeah, that would be my argument in favor of discussing things like giants and fairies and creationism and other such things that most people would deem just like totally asinine and irrational. So yeah.
Perfect. So Philip, over to you. You're the giant guy. So tell the person who, just to kind of, as a little preface, Graham will know as well as I do. That
Yeah.
Well, hold on. No, real quick. Philip is a pretty. Philip gets excited talking about the Giants, and that was one of the reasons, really, for us to have this broadcast in the first place. So I don't know. I think it's kind of cool that finally we're there, as it were. So Philip, go ahead and why are you so excited about this? Why is it important? What are they? Who are they? Where do they come from? Are they real? All that. So go ahead.
Yeah. So we get to talk about giants. When I first learned about giants, if anybody's looking for more sort of resources on this, I would recommend checking out Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung's podcast, The Lord of Spirits. This is where a lot of this information, if not all of it, is coming from. So to all of you Catholics out there, they're Orthodox priests. I would highly recommend checking out, because we've sort of lost this this notion of the mythical in the West, and are really consumed by once again this sort of material kind of spirit, if you will, although as contradictory as those terms seem. So I think we have to go back to religion in and of itself in order before we can actually get to these giants, right? So there's this notion that we have of, there were, and many people say this, oh, well, there were all these pagan gods, and Israel just sort of like pulled Yahweh out of one of these pantheon of gods, and that was the sort of thing. People always worship multiple gods from the beginning. However, more recent anthropology and archaeology has showed this is actually not the case. So you have, and this comes from a guy named Andrew Lang. He wrote a book called The Making of Religion. And basically one of the arguments he makes in this book is that all religion started out with the worship of one true God. That isn't, once again, they didn't reject the presence of the existence of other spiritual beings, but they only worshiped one God. And then you get to the point where these people sort of came to realize, right? Because if you have one all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, you're not going to be able to bribe him. So if you want to make a love potion, or you want to go make war on your neighbor and take his stuff, or you want this portion of land that belongs to this neighboring tribe, you want to go kill them and take everything, right? If you make a sacrifice to a most high God who doesn't need anything, he's not going to help you, right? There's nothing in it for him. He's not going to help you. But who will help you? Well, it's these gods these lesser gods, what we would call demons, who can sort of feed off this stuff. So slowly over time, people started worshiping these other gods, and this is made reference to in Genesis with the Tower of Babel. Slowly, all of these nations fall, right, and they start worshiping these other gods. So we really have to start with the demons before we sort of begin with anything else, right? So Genesis 6 is where the first sort of instance of these what's called the Nephilim, or giants, sort of pop up, right? And it follows as such. This is Genesis 6 verse 1 through 5. And after that, men began to be multiplied upon the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God, seeing the daughters of men, that they were fair, took to themselves wives, of all which they chose. And God said, My spirit shall not remain in man forever, because he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. Now giants, or Nephilim, as it translates some places, were upon the earth in those days. For after the sons of God went into the daughters of men, and they brought forth children, these are the mighty men of old, men of renown. And God, seeing that the wickedness of men was great upon the earth, and that all the thought of their heart was bent upon evil at all times, it repented him that he had made man on the earth. And being touched inwardly with sorrow of heart, he said, I will destroy man whom I have created from upon the earth, from man even to beast, from the creeping thing even to the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. That was actually verse 1 through 8. So that's the first instance we see of these giants, and at least in what we call the canon, right, of Scripture. So that term "sons of God" is important, because some people translate that and see that, and this is unfortunately already at the beginning a sort of demythical sort of translation, which they're not contradictory, right? They can be one, but I don't think the only sort of view on this is the one I'm about to say, right? So one view of this is the sons of God are the sons of Seth, right, or the third son of Adam and Eve, right? So the first view is, well, these are the sons of Seth. They defiled themselves with Cain's sons and made this wicked race of men, right? The lower brought down the higher, right? The only two fathers who really take that view are Saint Ephrem and Saint Augustine. Saint Ephrem is, I don't know why. Actually, you can read more about it on this book here, Hymns on Paradise, but it's because he had this sort of cosmological hierarchical view of where people lived after the fall, the layers of paradise. So that's why he takes that approach. Saint Augustine, it was more demystified. But all the other fathers take the view that it was both Seth and these angels, or just these angels, right? Because the phrase "sons of God" is translated the exact same. It's the same phrase in the book of Job, right? And the same verse in the Psalms, right? In the Psalms it says, I think it's Psalm 87, maybe. I could be wrong, but it says, don't quote me on that, but it says, you are sons of God, right? But you shall all die like men, right? It's not saying you are all men and you shall die like men. That doesn't make any sense, right? And that same verse is used in Job when God calls the divine council and it says the sons of God stood before the throne of God, right? Well, that sons of God, right, is the angels it's referring to, as these spiritual beings, right? So once again, these spiritual beings come down and they make these deformed hybrid creatures with these women. And this is where we get sort of these demigods from, people such as Hercules and Gilgamesh, right? They're 2/3 God and 1/3 human, right? You say 2/3 God, 1/3 human, that doesn't make any sense. How can that be? Well, that's just why the kings in these ancient societies were regarded as gods, right? Because there was this ritual that would take place. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's kind of gross, wherein the king would go up, he'd go up to the temple at these festival sort of cycles, and he would fornicate with a temple prostitute, right? He would call there, and there was this ritual that would take place that would call down a demon, right, in order to, if you will, possess. Maybe that's not even the right word. The king, and he would fornicate with this temple prostitute and produce this demonic offspring, right? And these guys and gigantes, or however you want to pronounce it, it's not necessarily referring to stature, but it's referring to like thug or bully, right? So it'd be something akin to, like Father Stephen DeYoung describes it as, like a strong man in a, just because a strong man in a South American dictatorship, right? It doesn't necessarily mean he's super jacked or anything like that. It just means he's a bully, he's a thug, he's a tyrant, right? So in the Book of Enoch, the same thing is described. It describes Azazel, who is also mentioned in the Bible, sort of gathering these demonic forces together to go down to fornicate with these women and producing these offspring. It's interesting to note in the Book of Enoch, actually, the giants are the same exact size as the ark that Noah builds in Genesis in terms of the number of cubits, right? It's the same exact size. So these giants were these groups, and so God floods the world, but they sort of come back, right, with these what Graham was referring to, these Apkallu, right? That sort of came back, and we see them in the book of Joshua, right? We see them again in the book of Joshua. God tells the Israelites to kill these certain tribes, and you think, well, that seems mean. I thought God was all loving, God was all kind. This is what people such as Dr. Matthew Ramage sort of put forward. Well, God can't really command people to kill other people because it's against his nature, because he's all loving. But we're not talking about just like plain people here. We're talking about these giant clans that were centered around this demonic king, right? They were so consumed with evil so obsessed with doing evil, so possessed by these demonic spirits, that there was no sort of turning back from them. They were, in a sense, the opposite of a saint, right? They were demonized, if you will, not demonized in the sense of people being mean to them, but literally they had turned themselves into demons. And that's sort of a short summary on that. We can get into more of the implications of what Dr. Ramage's view. He's a professor at Benedict, and his view on this stuff sort of go the trajectory in which it leads. But I'll leave it with the giants for there, and Graham can sort of pick up. I mean, you see, really what they are these hybrid creatures, right? You see in these Babylonian traditions, right? You actually see it in the Gospels, and we can get to that later. But you see in these Babylonian traditions, these half man, half fish creatures popping up out of the water and giving secret knowledge to these kings. Literally giving them technology, and that's what it's hinted at. Why Goliath has this ancient technology when he shows up to fight King David, right? It goes into great depth describing his armor and his weapons and all of that. And really, what it's making reference to is he has this old secret knowledge that was antediluvian, right? Pre-flood sort of knowledge that he had gained because of what he was, because he was one of these beings.
I would actually tie that. I mean, we're talking about materialism here, and the giants chest is a big one to open, right? Because it's like hard enough to convince people that God directly created the world in the manner that was described in Genesis, and it's also hard enough to convince people that the soul plays as much of a significance as it does in our everyday lives, and that demons are also just that significant in our everyday lives. This is very much a sidestep from the conversation, and we can, I think, dive into religious indifferentism and false ecumenism in another episode. But riding horseback on what Philip said there, not only are giants scriptural, and not only has it been perhaps revealed that giants are very real in terms of fossils and other such things, we won't even bother with that. But Psalm 96:5, Philip, as I'm sure you know, famously says that all the gods of the Gentiles are demons.
Devils.
Yeah, devils, demons. There are a whole bunch of translations, all the gods of the nations, all the god. But Jerome was pretty clear in this translation. And the dea-ghuí's Bible is pretty clear. We're not talking about the gods of nations. We're talking about the gods of Gentiles, right? So those would have been the pagans at that time. So if the gods of the Gentiles were demons at that time, it definitely has not changed. So that's why we ought to have absolutely zero respect, quote unquote, for other religions, quote unquote, because not only are they false religion, but they worship demons, right? And so we see this development in the modern day where people are scared of God, basically. And so in place of God, we have what we would call quasi-religious forms, which is something I've always been big about, is the concept of quasi-religious forms. And I hold to this day that the religious patrimony of the West is so strong because of Catholicism and even really rigid Protestant traditions. It's so strong that the removal of God so quickly as it's been in the last 100 years has necessitated for many people that they fill they take the place of God, which has been removed, and they fill it with everything else. So Philip mentioned the spirit of relativism, materialism, which sounds contradictory because there's no spirit, right? Materialists wouldn't suppose that there's a spirit. But the spirit of materialism, properly said, would actually refer to a demon. And we would understand that in the traditional Catholic mind, we would understand that the spirit of X typically means a demon. So like, let's say you know, like the spirit of lust, for example. It's not just like you're in a lustful mode. You're not in a lustful mind, or the spirit of gluttony. You're just not feeling gluttonous. We're talking about a legitimate demon here. And so when you say that the gods of the Gentiles are devils, we're looking at in a world right now where people separated from the Catholic Church, which is the new Israel, and therefore everybody outside of it is a Gentile. We would understand that scripturally. Their gods are demons. So the spirit of every vice that has replaced God in the last 100 years is a demon. So yeah, that would be my only commentary on that. Yeah,
Well,
so
look,
I'll
but at this,
clarify those remarks about the gods of the Gentiles being demons. So essentially, what I am not saying is that if you are religious but you are not Catholic, that does not necessarily mean that you're worshiping a demon, right? The best example would be the Orthodox Christians. They are in what we would call a state of schism, but we understand them to worship the same God as us, right? What I am actually saying, I'm referring to what we would call godless people or irreligious people, people who say that religion is a number of things that aren't actually good. They don't ascribe to any organized religion, and they don't practice any worship of any deity whatsoever. Those individuals, on account of the West being so traditional, will ipso facto worship the vices that they participate in because they actually lack the ability to properly repent, and so they will come to naturally deify the very things that they do, say, or what have you, in place of worshiping God, right? So in a case where someone would worship God and they were to have some period of adversity, and they would say, okay, I'm going to give this over to God, that would be due worship to God. If we were talking about an irreligious person, and instead of going to God, they were to say cope by some manner of gluttony or some manner of lust, right? They would actually be ceding their authority, or they would actually be ceding over to demons what would have been normally due to God. And so, since we as humans are directed to give that glory to God, and instead we are giving it to some vice, a demon will gladly take over and not only take the place of the worship that you inherently give by participating in that vice instead of giving it to God, but they will deify themselves in it and take that as an act of worship, basically, to them, which will empower the demon right in that person's life. So that's my clarification on that. Yeah, when I say we shouldn't respect other religions, I'm using a very specific scope, right? So when I say respect, what I'm trying to say is we shouldn't put other religions at the same level of dignity as the Catholic faith, right? If you are a Catholic, that's the position you should take, right? Right. You can't just go around and say, well, all religions have some truth to them, because that's ultimately a cop-out, and that's not actually true ecumenism. Because all you're doing is saying, well, we all kind of have the truth, so we can just be buddies. But if you want to actually take the gospel message of evangelization seriously, you should be looking to these people, and you shouldn't be telling them, hey, you're worshiping a demon. You should be saying, of course, you should be worshiping God in the fullness of his truth. But we understand that they actually are in grave risk of worshiping something other than the true God by being separate from the Catholic Church.
so when you're talking about demons, obviously without I don't know, without hesitation. I know, I guess most people I know might laugh at that. So can either or both of you try to, I don't know, make sense of the belief in the demonic, and maybe also with regard to the danger they're in, where, you know, what do they say? Speak of the devil and he shall appear, or whatever. So I don't know if Graham or Philip, do either of you want to take on that massive concept?
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
reality, other worlds. Basically, we're talking about the other world right now. So
yeah. I mean, we'll tag team. I mean, I think we've already, in a sense, sort of gotten to there is a spiritual realm, right? At least with God. But when we go back, you know, like once again, we go back to our experience of things, right? Even from the materialist point of view, if we just talk about our experience of things, this is not to be a existentialist or phenomenologist or what have you. But once again, we do notice, once again, groups of people animated by something other than themselves, right? Something higher taking them up and destroying things. And at the very least, right, we can say that is a demonic thing, right? Almost when a group of people acts like a tornado, right? They sweep through a town and destroy it. We saw this with, to be very controversial, the Black Lives Matter riots, you know, most recently. People are going to love hearing about this, right? But these people swept through cities, burning and and rioting and looting and other such, you know, and setting fire to things and destroying people's businesses and that sort of thing. And once again, that's not something individuals do on their own, right? There's never a case where just like one person went around destroying things by themselves, right? Because nobody does that separated from this group. So there has to be some principle animating that entire group. Otherwise, such an action wouldn't take place. It's not just a bunch of free-thinking individuals, right? It's this concept of like, oh, a government is just a bunch of free-thinking individuals who sort of get together, or it's like voting or something, or like polls online or whatever. It doesn't experientially, it doesn't work like that, and it never has. Right? Once again, the ancients never sort of pictured it to be this way. And we can talk about, in a bit or in another episode, even the founding of actual civilizations, right? But we know there's these what we call evil forces, right? That enact these things. Once again, like Graham was alluding to, like the spirit of something is not just referring to. It's not just like an idea or something like Hitler, for example, or Stalin. Like Stalin wasn't just like some bad guy who like thought up of all these ideas by himself, right? It was in the spirit of the age, right? Or Hitler in terms of colonialism, right? It wasn't just like Hitler was this bad dude who thought up of all these things by himself, right? He was taken up into something, because Hitler or Stalin or any, Genghis Khan or any of these bad people you're going to point towards in history, they never did these things by themselves, right? They never did any of this stuff by themselves. It was a spirit animating that sort of that body that they kind of controlled, right? It was this reverse parasitic process. It's not just like some individual has some bad idea and then he carries it out. Right. So that, I think experientially we can make an argument for demons in that sense. Right. It's like people think, how could these normal people have just done all of these horrible things? It's like, well, it wasn't just simply that. It wasn't just them. Like the only reason you ask this question is because we're a bit materialistic. Right. It's because there was this spirit going on, the spirit of the age.
Graham, can you come in here?
Yes.
And answer the same question. How do you make the case to a materialist for the demonic or whatever, the other world, in that sense, like that, not just a concept, an abstract notion of a creator, but like these are beings, as it were, haunting your sleep?
Mm-hmm. Personally, I would actually not try to make a case for the demonic to a materialist, strictly speaking, right? I mean, you would have to go through several processes before you could even have a materialist begin to understand that demons are a real acting force. So there are two things you could do to make a materialist understand that demons are real. One, God could will that a demon appears to this person and just scares the absolute, poop out of that person, or they have some other preternatural experience that's beyond explanation, and the emotion that they attribute to that experience is so strong that suddenly, a scientific perspective doesn't explain it, right? That would be one option for a materialist to really believe in the demonic. The second option, which is most coherent and probably most consistent, would be to firstly demonstrate to them that God exists, and then secondly demonstrate to them in some way that Jesus Christ is that God, or the Holy Trinity is that God. And then naturally that, you would believe in divine revelation from that point forward, and it explains the demonic. And that would just be it. I think anything else is probably a waste of time. But I think if you have open discussions like we are right now of the demonic and of these things, then it probably will kind of trigger some sort of curiosity or some mythical curiosity in the human spirit that we know all people are subject to, all people. Right. I've heard of just, I know a handful of people who their conversion experience to Catholicism specifically has been through some understanding of the demonic. some demonic experience, or believing in divine revelation and then studying demonology and then realizing that, you know, there's something actually real going on here, and it's a battle between good and evil, right? If there's the good, then there must be some contrast, although lesser in power, and that's the evil. So
I think that's a pretty good answer. Do either of you, I don't know, could this be a good place to round off for today?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Philip?
Yeah. I mean, one last note on that. I think the last thing is if you want to be super duper materialist and go anthropology, you know, and how civilizations were found. If we want to talk about this, for instance, more and more people are starting to discover that civilizations were not founded because people wanted to trade and have commerce, and they discovered farming or something, because that's ridiculous, right? You don't farm. Nobody farmed in the ancient world because that's an easy way for people to come and take your stuff. Right? Your stuff's all in one place. It's like, hey, all of their sheep are here. I'm going to kill them and take the sheep because I'm hungry too. Right? That's not how it worked. It actually turns out, which more and more of these anthropologists are coming to discover, that cities, the origin of cities, which we can also talk about biblically next time, sort of comes from this notion of religion, right? Cities were founded because of experiences that people had with these spiritual beings, right? So they set up temples at these places because they had a spiritual encounter, and then they built cities around that temple. You know, because you have to feed, you have to feed the god, you have to feed the priests, and then, well, now you have to farm in order to offer these certain sacrifices, and it's like, and then, then it's everybody settling in these places. So that's my last sort of argument in terms of that. But other than that, I think it's a good place to sort of wrap up.
Well, thank you both. This was, I don't know if it was any good. I don't know if people enjoy listening, but I enjoyed talking to both of you, and I appreciate your knowledge and time and patience and all that. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Fergus, it was Graham. Good to see you guys. I enjoyed
pleasure.
it.
All right, until the next time. Adios.
Adios.
Okay, I asked Graham earlier for his email address. Maybe he'll be more cooperative this time around. But Philip, where can people find you, or where do you suggest them to go if they've been interested in anything you've been talking about, or whatever? If they want to contact you, even you might give your number. I don't know. But Philip,
Yeah.
and then Graham, both of you, what are your Twitter handles, as it were?
Yeah, so we'll just go over some of the sources I mentioned. A lot of the stuff you want to read more about the anti-materialist sort of point of view, you can check out this book. It's called The Language of Creation. It's by Matthew Pajot. And you can also check out his brother's YouTube channel, The Symbolic World. It talks about a lot of these materials things. Another big thing mentioned was the Lord of Spirits podcast, which is a very good work. And then Dr. Gavin Kerr, who is a professor at St. Patrick's in Maynooth. I write some blog posts for Graham's website, which he's about to introduce, and I'll be writing blog posts for that, so they can find more of my work, I guess, there. And you can find my email if you want to contact me about anything in the show notes, which our friend Fergus will kindly provide in the show notes, so, or in the description.
Graham?
Everything that I talked about, you could just find in Philip's sources. We're going to continue to upload blog posts that discuss these different topics and delve into the realm of mythology and theology and philosophy and history, anthropology, all of that. And you can actually find all of those blog posts at www.thenewkingdom.net. And of course, our email is on that website if you want to reach out for more information to either myself or Philip. So yeah.
All right, I think that's it for the second time. Adios.
Adios.
Savage.